On the plains of the 1870s, a man's future was not measured in gold or land, but in kernels of wheat. A single sack of seed grain was the fragile container for a year of hope, a bulwark against starvation, and the promise of the next season. Yet this promise was almost always stored in the most vulnerable of places. A wooden box, sitting on the surface of the earth, exposed to the same hostile elements that had waged war on the farmer all year long. This is why, on a smoke-choked morning after the Great Fire had passed, the landscape was a testament to universal failure. Barns were reduced to blackened squares of ash. Granaries were smoldering heaps of charcoal and cooked grain. The air smelled of ruin. But on a gentle rise on Caleb's land, a single patch of earth, scorched blacker than the rest, held a different story. It held the future, buried and safe, in the cool, silent dark. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of quiet, forgotten genius resonate with you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. 2 years before the fire, Caleb had learned the conventional lesson of the plains. He had built his first granary with pride. The timber was good, felled from the small creek bed miles away, and he had squared the logs with an adze until they fit together with satisfying precision. The roof was pitched steeply to shed the snow and rain, the floor raised a foot off the ground on stone piles to discourage mice. He had followed the accumulated wisdom of his neighbors, building a structure that was, by all accounts, a fine example of its kind. Into it he poured the fruit of his first successful harvest, a river of golden wheat that filled the wooden bin almost to the top. It was more than food, it was his stake in this new world, the seed that would seed his future. The trouble did not arrive with a bang, but with a whisper. It came as a slow, persistent autumn rain that lasted for 10 straight days. It was not a violent storm, just a gray, weeping sky that saturated everything. The air grew heavy with moisture. A damp chill crept into the cabin, into the bones. Caleb checked the granary daily. The roof did not leak. The interior seemed dry. But the wood of the structure itself was drinking from the air. The very walls, which were meant to protect, were acting like a sponge. A faint, musty smell began to rise from the grain, a smell like damp earth and decay. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, what was happening. He plunged his arm deep into the bin. It was warm, not the neutral coolness of dry grain, but a subtle, living heat. Deep inside the pile, countless thousands of kernels, tricked by the moisture and the warmth generated by their own mass, were beginning to germinate. The process of life had become the process of destruction. He and his young son Isaac spent the next 3 days hauling the grain out, spreading it on tarps in the faint hope the sun would appear and dry it out. But the sky remained a sheet of leaden gray. The wheat was a total loss. What didn't sprout began to mold. A black, fuzzy growth crept through the pile, rendering it poisonous to man and beast. Caleb stood before the ruin of his year's work, the physical manifestation of his family's security, now a stinking, rotting heap. The financial blow was catastrophic. He had to take a loan from the mercantile in town at a ruinous rate of interest just to buy seed for the next spring. That winter was lean, marked by short rations and the gnawing anxiety of debt. He had done everything right, followed all the rules, and had been met with complete failure. The failure was not simply a matter of bad weather. Caleb spent that long winter analyzing the event with the cold precision of a mechanic examining a broken engine. The problem was the design itself. A wooden structure sitting above ground was a fundamentally flawed vessel for storing the most precious commodity on the prairie. It was vulnerable to every possible threat. Moisture was the first enemy. It didn't need to be a leak. The very air carried it inside. The wood absorbed it, the grain absorbed it, and the cycle of rot began. Then there were the pests. Mice could be discouraged by stone footings, but they were persistent. A single knothole or a warped board was an invitation. Weevils and other insects were a constant, unseen threat, capable of turning a bin of healthy grain into dust. And beyond all that was the ultimate specter: fire. A prairie fire driven by the relentless wind would consume a wooden granary in minutes, leaving nothing behind. The standard method of storage was not just imperfect, it was an act of profound and foolish optimism. It was a gamble against nature, and nature always held the better cards. Grief curdled into a cold, quiet anger. It was not an anger directed at God or at the rain, but at the stubborn acceptance of a flawed system. His neighbors spoke of the loss in hushed, sympathetic tones, but their words were laced with a kind of fatalism. "Sometimes the weather just turns against you," one said. "It's the risk we take," said another. They saw it as an act of unavoidable misfortune, a matter of luck. Caleb saw it as a failure of engineering. He looked at their granaries, identical to the one he had built, and saw not structures of security, but monuments to a shared, unexamined vulnerability. The problem was not bad luck, it was a bad design, and it could be solved. This realization became an obsession. It took root in his mind and crowded out nearly everything else. The daily rhythms of the homestead, mending fences, tending the few livestock, clearing stones from the fields, became secondary tasks, performed mechanically. His true work began after his son was asleep and the cabin was quiet. By the flickering light of a tallow lamp, he would take a piece of charcoal and sketch on the back of a smoothed pine board. He drew diagrams of his failed granary with arrows showing the imagined pathways of moisture. He drew cross-sections of the earth, trying to understand how the frost moved through the soil. His focus became a source of quiet concern for Isaac, who saw his father grow more distant, his gaze often fixed on some middle distance that only he could see. He would stop in the middle of a field, staring at a particular slope of the land, lost in thought. The community noticed, too. His participation in communal activities dwindled. He was no longer the first to volunteer for a barn raising or a collective hunt. He became a solitary figure, consumed by a problem no one else even recognized as solvable. They whispered that the loss of his crop had unsettled him, that he was dwelling on his misfortune. They did not understand that he was not dwelling on the past, but methodically designing the future. His research was not confined to sketches on a board. He began a quiet, deliberate journey of observation. He would ride to neighboring homesteads, ostensibly to trade for some small item or to share news, but his real purpose was to inspect their storage methods. He asked casual but pointed questions. "Ever have trouble with damp in that corner? How do you keep the rats out?" He would listen intently, nodding, his eyes scanning the construction of their bins and cellars. He confirmed his suspicion. The problem was universal. Every farmer fought a constant low-grade war against moisture and pests. Some were luckier than others, their granaries situated on drier ground or built with more seasoned timber, but the fundamental vulnerability was always there. He expanded his study beyond granaries. He spent an entire afternoon examining the root cellar of a German family who were known for their ability to keep potatoes and carrots fresh well into the spring. He noted the deep excavation, the stone walls, the thick sod roof that kept it cool in summer and prevented a hard freeze in winter. He felt the air inside, cool and slightly damp, but not wet. It was a stable environment. The earth itself was the primary insulator. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. The ground was not the enemy. It was a tool. His most important conversation came from an unexpected source. A traveling stonemason, a man named Bartholomew, was hired to build a proper hearth and chimney for the small schoolhouse being erected near the settlement. Caleb watched him work for hours. Bartholomew was a craftsman of few words, but his hands were eloquent. He laid a foundation not of solid stone, but of carefully selected fist-sized rocks, creating a deep, porous bed. Caleb asked him why. "For drainage," the mason said, barely looking up from his trowel. "If you set your foundation flat on the soil, the water sits against it. Frost gets in the cracks, heaves the stone, and your chimney falls down. This way, the water has somewhere to go. It falls through the rock and away from the stone." The stonemason then explained another technique. For the parts of the chimney base that would be buried, he would coat the exterior of the stones with a thick layer of hot pitch. "It's a barrier," he explained, wiping sweat from his brow. "The water in the soil can press all it wants, but it can't get through the pitch to the stone. The stone stays dry. The foundation stays stable. Drainage and a barrier. Not one or the other, but both, working together as a system." Caleb felt a jolt of understanding. He wasn't just building a chimney. He was managing the subterranean movement of water. He began observing the natural world with a new eye. He watched a prairie dog colony during a downpour. Their mounds were not just random piles of dirt, they were engineered structures. The entrances were raised to prevent water from flowing in, and the tunnels seemed to follow the contours of the land, likely designed to shed water away from the deeper living chambers. Animals that lived underground did not fight the earth, they worked with it. They used its properties to create safe, dry spaces. All the pieces clicked into place one evening as he stared at his latest drawing. The German's root cellar provided stable temperature. The stonemason's foundation provided the principles of drainage and a moisture barrier. The prairie dog's burrow provided the concept of using elevation and slope. The solution was not a box on top of the earth. It was a carefully engineered chamber within the earth, a space that did not try to defy the properties of the ground, but to harness them. It would be a dry-lined, well-drained, insulated vault, a place where grain could be kept safe from water, pests, and even fire. The singular focus now had a concrete purpose. The vague obsession transformed into a detailed architectural plan. He spent another week refining his drawings, calculating depths, angles, and quantities. He knew the work would be immense, far greater than building another wooden granary. But he also knew it would be permanent. It would be a solution, not another temporary defense destined to fail. He rode to the trading post in town, his list of required materials clutched in his hand. The proprietor, Mr. Gable, read the list with a furrowed brow. "Caleb, what in tarnation are you building?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles. The list was unlike any he had seen from a homesteader. There was no lumber, no nails, no shingles. Instead, Caleb requested 24 clay drainage tiles, the kind used for draining marshy fields back east. He asked for 3 barrels of black pitch. He needed a wagon load of coarse sand and another of fine gravel. "Building a well?" Gable inquired. "No," Caleb replied simply. "A place to keep my seed." Gable shook his head, filled the order, and watched Caleb's wagon pull away with a mixture of pity and confusion. The man, he concluded, had been driven to strange projects by his misfortune. Caleb chose the location with immense care. It was not the most convenient spot close to his cabin, but the best from an engineering standpoint. He selected a slight, almost imperceptible rise in the prairie, a place where the ground was naturally inclined to shed water. He marked out a perfect rectangle, 10 feet long and 6 feet wide, and began to dig. The work was brutal. The prairie topsoil was a thick, tangled mat of grass roots, which he had to chop through with a sharpened spade. Below that was a dense layer of clay, heavy and stubborn. He worked from dawn until dusk, his body aching, his hands raw. Isaac helped where he could, hauling buckets of dirt away in a small handcart, his young face a mask of quiet determination, trusting his father's strange vision completely. This was not the digging of a simple cellar. Every move was precise. He used a spirit level and a plumb line to ensure the walls were perfectly vertical and the corners true. He excavated to a depth of 8 feet, 2 feet deeper than his plan required. This extra depth was for the foundation, the most critical part of the entire system. Once the pit was dug, a gaping, sharp-edged wound in the earth, he began the first stage of construction. He painstakingly filled the bottom 2 feet with the coarse gravel he had bought, creating a thick, porous layer. Next came the clay drainage tiles. He laid them in a precise pattern within the gravel bed, forming a grid. Each tile was sloped at a subtle but consistent angle, all leading to a single point at the downslope end of the pit. From that point, he dug a narrow trench leading 50 yards away to a lower-lying area of his property. He laid a final line of tiles in this trench, creating an outlet for the entire system. Any water that seeped into the gravel foundation would now have a clear, unobstructed path to be carried far away from the cache. This was the secret engine of his invention, a hidden network designed to bleed the earth dry. With the drainage system in place, he laid the floor. He used flat, heavy flagstones he had prized from a rocky outcrop a mile from his claim. He spent days chipping and shaping them, ensuring they fit together with minimal gaps. He laid them directly on top of the gravel bed, creating a solid, dry surface. Then, he began the walls. He used the dry stacking method the stonemason had spoken of, carefully selecting and placing stones without mortar. This was counterintuitive to most builders, who would have sealed the joints. But Caleb wanted the opposite. He wanted any moisture that might press through the earth and bypass his outer defenses to have a path of least resistance. It would weep through the gaps in the stone wall and run down into the gravel drainage bed below, rather than being trapped in the wall itself. The construction took weeks, stretching from late summer into the early autumn. It was a slow, methodical process of lifting, placing, and fitting. The stone walls rose steadily, a testament to his relentless labor. Once the walls reached ground level, he began the most unpleasant part of the job, the moisture barrier. He built a fire and heated the barrels of pitch until the black tar was bubbling and liquid. Using a crude brush made of bound twigs, he coated the entire exterior surface of the stone walls. The work was hot, smoky, and foul-smelling. He slathered on the pitch, forcing it into every crack and crevice, creating a thick, waterproof skin around his subterranean chamber. Before backfilling the pit, he added one more layer to his system. He shoveled the coarse sand he had purchased into the gap between the pitched stone wall and the earthen wall of the excavation. The sand would act as a final filter, wicking any ambient ground moisture downward into the gravel bed, preventing it from ever sitting against the pitched wall for any length of time. He was not just blocking water, he was actively channeling and redirecting it. He was imposing his own order on the chaotic hydrology of the soil. His neighbors, particularly a man named Marcus, watched the project with a mixture of amusement and scorn. Marcus was a successful farmer, a man who trusted tradition and had little patience for newfangled ideas. His own granary was the largest in the area, a proud monument to his prosperity. He would often ride over to the edge of Caleb's property and watch him toil in the giant hole. "Still digging to China, Caleb?" he would call out, a smirk on his face. He nicknamed the project Caleb's Folly. "What happens when the first hard rain comes?" Marcus asked him one day, dismounting from his horse and walking to the edge of the pit. "This whole thing will fill up like a cistern. You're building a tomb for your grain, not a storehouse." Caleb, his face and arms streaked with dirt and pitch, simply looked up and said, "It will be dry." His quiet certainty only seemed to amuse Marcus more. "You've let that one bad year get to your head," Marcus said, shaking his own. "The answer is to build a better granary, not to bury your seed like a gopher." The sentiment was shared by others. The community saw Caleb's project as a profound waste of time and energy, a fool's errand born of grief and stubbornness. They saw a man digging a hole, not a man engineering a solution. Caleb ignored the mockery. He did not argue or try to explain the complex system of drainage and barriers he was constructing. He knew the words would be useless. The proof would not be in the explanation, but in the result. His quiet persistence was unshakable. He worked with an obsessive precision, his focus absolute. Each stone was placed with care. Each layer of material was applied exactly as he had planned. He was not just building a structure, he was conducting an experiment, and he would not allow any variable to be compromised by haste or distraction. The sideways glances and whispered comments of his neighbors were like the wind, present but irrelevant to the task at hand. The final stages of the construction involved the parts that were hidden from view but were essential to the system's success. Inside the stone chamber, he built a secondary wall and floor of cured wooden planks, but he did not place the wood directly against the stone. He left a 2-inch air gap, a space for air to circulate freely. This would prevent any condensation from forming on the wood and ensure that the stored grain sacks were never in direct contact with the potentially cool stone. Small, screened vents, cleverly hidden under the lip of the entrance, would allow for a tiny but constant exchange of air, preventing the atmosphere inside from becoming stale. The roof was another piece of careful engineering. He laid heavy timber beams across the stone walls, covered them with a solid layer of thick planks, and then coated the entire wooden surface with 2 layers of pitch. On top of this waterproof membrane, he placed a foot-thick layer of packed earth, and finally, he carefully transplanted the original prairie sod he had excavated from the site. When he was finished, the structure was nearly invisible, blending seamlessly into the gentle rise of the land. The only sign of its existence was a low, angled entrance frame. The entrance itself was a heavy hatch, built like a fortress door. It was made of 2 layers of thick planks, with a layer of packed wool insulation between them. It was fitted into an angled frame so that rain would naturally run off it, and it was sealed with a wide, overlapping lip to prevent water from being driven inside by the wind. It was not just a door. It was a final, formidable seal against the outside world. He finished his work in the last week of October. The air had a sharp, autumnal bite, and the skies were beginning to take on the gray hue of the coming winter. The timing was perfect. His own modest harvest, which he and Isaac had carefully threshed by hand, was ready. He filled a dozen burlap sacks with the clean, dry seed wheat. With a sense of quiet ceremony, he carried them one by one down the short flight of stone steps and into the cool, dark chamber. The air inside smelled of fresh-cut pine, dry earth, and stone. It was a clean, stable smell. He stacked the sacks on the raised wooden platform, latched the heavy door, and walked away. His experiment had begun. He did not have to wait long for the first test. A week later, the weather turned. A storm system moved in from the north, bringing with it a week of relentless, soaking rain. It was the same kind of weather that had ruined him 2 years prior. The prairie became a sea of mud. Creeks overflowed their banks. The air was thick with a dampness that seemed to penetrate every wall. In cabins across the settlement, buckets were placed to catch drips from leaking roofs, and a general gloom set in. Marcus and the others looked towards Caleb's land, imagining the water pouring into his subterranean folly, creating a muddy, worthless soup of his precious seed. Caleb waited. He did not check the cache during the storm. He trusted his design. He watched the rain from his cabin window, a quiet confidence settling over him. He observed the area around the nearly invisible structure. Water did not pool. It flowed gently around the rise. On the 8th day, the rain stopped, and a weak sun finally broke through the clouds. The world steamed and dripped around him. He walked out to the cache, the soggy ground sucking at his boots. He took a deep breath, unlatched the heavy hatch, and pulled it open. A puff of cool, dry air met his face. It was a stark contrast to the humid, heavy air outside. He descended the stone steps, his lamp casting a warm glow on the interior. The flagstone floor was bone dry. The wooden walls were dry to the touch. The burlap sacks were exactly as he had left them, showing no signs of dampness or mildew. The air was fresh and clean. The system had worked. He walked the 50 yards to the outlet of his drainage pipe. A small but steady trickle of clear water was emerging, spilling onto the lower ground. It was the captured and defeated enemy, harmlessly ejected from his fortress. He had not just stored his grain, he had created a small, independent climate perfectly engineered for preservation. Marcus rode by later that day. He saw Caleb emerge from the ground, a sack of wheat over his shoulder. He couldn't hide his surprise. "Still dry in there," he called out, his voice betraying a hint of grudging respect. "Bone dry," Caleb replied, his tone even. Marcus grunted. "You got lucky with the drainage, I suppose. It's a clever trick. But wait until the winter freeze comes. The frost will heave this whole place apart from below. That stone will crack like an eggshell." He rode off, still clinging to his skepticism, unwilling to admit that Caleb's folly might be a work of quiet genius. The rest of the community saw it as a minor curiosity, a strange solution to a problem most had simply accepted. They remained unconvinced, attributing his success to luck or a particularly well-chosen spot. The winter came and went. The ground froze solid, then thawed in a messy, muddy spring. Caleb's cache remained inviolate. The deep gravel bed had insulated the foundation from the worst of the frost heave, and the structure remained sound. He planted his seed, and it grew true. He had a successful harvest the next year, and the year after that. The cache became a normal part of his routine, a reliable tool that performed its function perfectly and silently. His neighbors, however, forgot about it. It was just Caleb's root cellar, a strange feature of his homestead, no longer a subject of ridicule, but not one of imitation either. They continued to use their wooden granaries, patching leaks, setting traps for mice, and preying against fire. The ultimate test came on a blistering hot day in late August of the 3rd year. A lightning strike miles to the west ignited the dry prairie grass. Fanned by a strong, hot wind, the small fire exploded into a roaring inferno. A wall of flame 50 feet high began to sweep across the plains, devouring everything in its path. The sky turned a terrifying shade of orange and black. The air grew thick with smoke and ash. The sound was a deafening roar, like 1,000 freight trains. It was the kind of fire that became legend, the kind that old men would speak of for generations. Panic erupted across the settlement. There was no time to save possessions, only lives. Families grabbed their children and ran for the wide, plowed fire breaks or the relative safety of the creek bed. The fire moved with terrifying speed. It was a living entity, hungry and indiscriminate. It leaped roads and small clearings with ease. As it reached the homesteads, the sound of the roar was joined by the sharp crack of burning timber. The dry wood of the cabins and barns, baked by the summer sun, went up like kindling. The systemic failure of conventional wisdom was absolute and terrifyingly swift. Granaries, the very symbols of the settlers' hard-won security, became their funeral pyres. The fire consumed Marcus's enormous barn in less than 10 minutes, the structure collapsing inward in a shower of sparks and embers. Inside, his entire harvest, and, more importantly, all his seed for the coming year, turned to black, useless carbon. The same story was repeated across every homestead in the fire's path. Decades of accumulated labor and generations of future hope were incinerated in a single afternoon. The community's wealth stored in vulnerable wooden boxes was wiped from the face of the earth. Caleb and Isaac took refuge in a wide, freshly plowed field, covering their faces with wet cloths against the choking smoke. They watched as the firestorm descended upon their own land. Their small barn, filled with hay, erupted in a geyser of flame. The fire swept over the fields, consuming the stubble from the recent harvest. And then it roared directly over the gentle rise where the cache was hidden. The sod on the roof, dried by the summer heat, was scorched black instantly. For a moment it seemed impossible that anything could survive such a direct assault. The heat was so intense it cracked stones and melted glass in the cabin windows. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the wall of fire passed, continuing its destructive march eastward, leaving behind a blackened, smoking wasteland. The next morning, the survivors emerged into a changed world. The landscape was a uniform black, stretching to the horizon. The air was acrid with the smell of ash and despair. Pockets of smoke still rose from the smoldering foundations of what had once been homes and barns. People wandered through the ruins of their lives, their faces numb with shock. Marcus stood before the blackened footprint of his great barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Everything was gone. They had their lives, but they had no food, no shelter, and most critically, no seed. Without seed, there would be no spring planting. Without planting, there would be no harvest. The fire had not just destroyed their present, it had erased their future. Amidst this universal devastation, Caleb walked calmly across his own blackened fields. He headed directly for the scorched patch of earth on the rise. A small crowd of his neighbors, including Marcus, watched him, their expressions hollow. They saw him pry at the edges of the heavy hatch, which had been blackened and charred by the heat. With a groan of protest, the door opened. A wave of cool air, untouched by the inferno, washed out of the opening. Caleb descended into the darkness. A moment later, he reappeared, a heavy burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He walked over to where Marcus stood. He did not say a word. He simply set the sack down, pulled out his knife, and sliced it open. A stream of perfect golden wheat kernels poured onto the blackened ground. They were cool to the touch, unharmed, carrying the faint, clean smell of dry earth. In that moment, surrounded by ash and ruin, the small pile of grain was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. It was not just wheat. It was survival. It was hope. Caleb's folly had weathered the apocalypse. The vindication was absolute, silent, and undeniable. He held the future of their entire community in his hands, saved by a hole in the ground. Later that day, after the shock had begun to recede and the grim reality of their situation had settled in, Marcus approached Caleb. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary humility. His face was smudged with soot. His clothes were singed. "Caleb," he began, his voice low and raspy, "I was a fool. I mocked you." He gestured vaguely at the smoking landscape. "And now, this." He paused, struggling to find the words. Can you show me how you built it? I need to build one. We all do." It was not just a request for help. It was an admission of total defeat for the old way of thinking and a plea for a new one. Caleb felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of purpose. He had not built the cache to prove anyone wrong, but to solve a problem. He had been motivated by the prevention of this exact kind of tragedy. "Of course," he said simply. "We'll start tomorrow." He shared his grain freely, ensuring every family had enough to eat through the winter and, crucially, enough seed to plant when spring arrived. He sought no payment, no advantage. His only condition was that everyone worked together. That autumn was a season of frantic, hopeful industry. Guided by Caleb, the community worked to build caches on every homestead. He shared his charcoal sketches, explaining the principles with patience and clarity. He taught them about the gravel drainage bed, the dry stacked walls, the pitch barrier, the air gap, and the insulated sod roof. He oversaw the digging, the stone laying, the whole methodical process. They were not just rebuilding, they were re-engineering their entire approach to survival. As they worked, variations began to emerge. One family, whose land was mostly clay, learned to fire their own drainage tiles. Another, with access to a different kind of stone, developed a slightly different stacking technique. The core principles, however, remained the same. The idea was spreading, adapting to the specific conditions of each piece of land. By the first snowfall, 6 new subterranean caches, all based on Caleb's design, were complete and filled with the seed he had provided. The community was no longer a collection of vulnerable individuals, but a network of resilient, prepared survivors. The following spring, a traveling builder named Jonathan passed through the area. He had been hired to help rebuild some of the cabins and was known for his skill and experience. He was immediately struck by the strange, sod-covered humps on each farm. He saw Marcus retrieving sacks of seed from his new cache and asked him about it. Marcus, now a fervent convert, explained the whole system, giving full credit to Caleb. Jonathan, a practical man with an eye for clever design, was immensely impressed. He sought out Caleb and spent a week with him, sketching the design in a worn leather-bound notebook and taking meticulous notes on the construction process. "This is genius," Jonathan said, tapping his pencil on his notes. "Simple, cheap, and it works. People need to know about this." Jonathan took the knowledge with him as he traveled west into new territories. He was a natural disseminator. At each new settlement he visited, he would share the plans for what he called the Prairie Cache. He didn't always mention Caleb's name. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he forgot. The idea was too powerful to remain tied to one man. It took on a life of its own. It was simple enough to be explained in a letter or sketched on a piece of scrap wood. The design was passed from farmer to farmer, becoming a piece of essential folk knowledge. It was given different names in different places: the sod cellar in Nebraska, the fireproof vault in the Dakotas. The origin was forgotten, but the function endured. Caleb's innovation became an anonymous, standard practice for any sensible person trying to survive on the plains. Decades passed. The raw prairie gave way to a patchwork of established farms and small towns. Caleb grew old. He lived a quiet, unassuming life, respected as one of the original settlers, a good neighbor, and a steady presence in the community. His son Isaac took over the farm, using the same cache his father had built so many years ago. It had never failed. No one spoke of the Great Fire anymore, except as a distant legend, and no one remembered Caleb as the man whose strange obsession had saved them all. He was simply Caleb, the farmer. The quiet innovator's role had faded from collective memory, replaced by the simple, unquestioned existence of the thing he had created. He was buried in the small cemetery on a hill, overlooking the fields he had tamed. The gravestone was simple, carved from local stone. It read, "Caleb, husband, father, farmer." There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph celebrating the invention that had secured the future of countless families across the West. His contribution was not written in stone, but in the continued existence of the communities he had made possible. His was a quiet, unrecognized, and profoundly important legacy. The impact of his innovation was unmeasurable, but real. It was counted in the number of homesteads that did not fail after a fire, in the families who did not face starvation after a wet autumn, in the communities that had the stability to grow and prosper. The prairie cache became common sense, its origins as mysterious and as fundamental as the plow itself. Later generations would find the remains of old, collapsed caches on abandoned homesteads and wonder at the purpose of the strange, stone-lined pits, never fully understanding that they were looking at the foundations of their own world. Years later, long after Caleb was gone, a young boy on a prosperous farm was sent by his father on a familiar errand. "Go fetch the seed wheat from the cellar," his father said, pointing toward a gentle, sod-covered rise in the field. The boy ran to the heavy, angled hatch, a design unchanged in its core principles for over half a century. He pulled it open and descended the cool stone steps into the familiar, earthy darkness. He was surrounded by the scent of dry grain and security, a scent he had known his entire life. He was stepping into a small pocket of manufactured stability, a simple, life-saving piece of architecture, utterly unaware of the desperate tragedy and the obsessive, quiet genius that had given it birth.